Hello Fear fans, and welcome to Everything Fear, your one-stop shop for all things horror. I'm Kit Tinsley. I'm a horror author, film academic and general horror geek. Today is episode 14 in our series A Life in Horror. In this series, I look at my personal top 5 horror movies of every year that I've been alive. And this time, it's the year 1991. Before we get started, there's one thing I've noticed about this series, is that the years that are easy to do are the ones where there's a handful of really good horror movies. But there's two types of year that are really hard. The years where there are so many great horror movies that it's almost impossible to whittle it down to 5 favourites. And the years where there's so few good horror movies, it's hard to actually find 5. 1990 was a really good year that was really hard to whittle down to just 5. 1991, on the other hand, was not a great year for horror. However, these are my personal top 5 of 1991. Number 5, Sometimes They Come Back. This adaptation of a Stephen King short story is the tale of a man returning to his hometown with his family. Taking a teaching job, he soon comes to realise that the bullies that tormented him as a child, and who subsequently died, have somehow come back to life and are in his class. With a strong central performance from Tim Matheson, and a story that focuses on the idea that the scars of bullying can affect people for the rest of their lives, Sometimes They Come Back stands out as a thoughtful King adaptation. The film was successful enough to spawn several sequels, although they never quite reached the quality of story and performance that the first movie did. Number 4, Child's Play 3. Chucky's second sequel outing is something of a controversial movie here in the UK, due to its involvement in the tragic case of James Bulger. James Bulger was a toddler who was brutally murdered by 2 10-year-old boys. There was some evidence that the boys had watched this movie, and it was suggested that it had inspired this horrendous act that they committed. This led to a whole new moral panic against horror movies in the UK, and almost a second Video Nasties incident. However, the film itself is a pretty good sequel. It was the last before the postmodern reinvention of the character in Bride of Chucky. Though Child's Play 3 is nowhere near as tense or inventive as the original Child's Play, it's certainly an improvement on the second movie. Number 3, Popcorn. Popcorn was something of a flop on its original release. I personally remember seeing it way back in the early 90s and really enjoying it then. But it was only when I rewatched this film a couple of years ago that I realised what an underrated gem it really is. The film came a full 5 years before Scream, but there are some strong similarities between the two movies. They're both slasher movies that pay homage to and poke fun at equally the genre itself. They are both self-referential and have characters who are obsessed with rules of horror movies. In Popcorn, a group of film students set up a horror movie marathon at an abandoned cinema. The movies within the movie are all loving homages to the gimmick movies of William Castle. Add to this a Phantom of the Opera style plot, and what you have is an endlessly entertaining movie that comes at a point where the slasher movie was dying a death. If this movie had been released a few years later, it would have been a huge success, I'm sure. Number 2, The People Under the Stairs. The 1990s saw a renaissance for Wes Craven. Though he had released some really good movies in the mid to late 80s, none of them had lived up to his cinematic masterpiece A Nightmare on Elm Street, which came out in 1984. His first movie of the 1990s was this, The People Under the Stairs. On the surface, this is a pretty straightforward horror movie about a young boy who breaks into a rich couple's mansion only to find out that they are crazed psychopaths who keep teenagers imprisoned within the walls of their home. However, this movie is bursting with deeper levels. On the one hand, it's a sociological comment about the rich-poor divide and the perversion and corruption that come so seemingly automatically with wealth. It's also a classical fairy tale, with a princess locked up in a tower, monsters to be overthrown, and even buried treasure to be found. Craven skillfully blends all of these elements into an action-packed, unnerving rollercoaster ride of a movie. If you enjoy this video, if you could please give us a like, subscribe, and maybe tickle that bell to be notified when we upload future content, that would be great, thank you. Number 1, The Silence of the Lambs. There will of course be those who are going to argue that Silence of the Lambs isn't a horror movie, it's a thriller. However, as far as I'm concerned, it is most definitely a horror movie. This movie deals with brutal serial killers, cannibalism, monsters in dungeons, and the darkness that can be found within the human mind. Of course, I can see why the film was marketed as a thriller. After all, I doubt it would have done quite as well at the Oscars had it been promoted as a horror movie, because it's well known that the Academy has no time for horror. But this movie doesn't make you feel thrilled, this movie makes you feel scared, like a horror movie. Jonathan Demme's masterful direction and outstanding performances from Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins definitely elevate this movie above most horror movies. But Hopkins, despite winning the Oscar, he is playing this character as a movie monster and not a real person. A magnificent piece of horror cinema that definitely led the way for later films like Seven. Well, that was my personal top 5 movies of 1991. Let me know your favourites in the comments down below. And until next time, stay scared and stay tuned.